The reason that we have brought Holly here in this shameful display of child exploitation is to ask a very fundamental question, and I think I know what the answer is, but does Holly have a mind? The title of this panel is Changing the Brain, Mind Over Matter. And possibly one way of getting into the subject is simply of asking what we're talking about. What is the relationship between mind, our mental activities, and matter, which is our brain, but perhaps the matter that we're concerned about is more than just the brain. Perhaps it's the whole body. So I'm asking for quick definitions of something it's almost impossible to define, the relationship between the mind and the brain, and what actually the mind is. Susan Greenfield, what would you say about this?
Well, my mind hasn't changed from an hour ago when I gave the definition, that I think it's the personalization of the physical brain. I don't buy into the old dichotomy that there's some kind of airy-fairy, insubstantial, exotic thing called mind, as opposed to the squalor of the chemistry that I work in. And I think that we don't understand how this personalization of the brain translates into subjective states and viewpoints and so on. But nonetheless, we know for sure that it does happen. And I think part of the issue, and something that's fascinating, is the relationship, and I'm sure Dan, without putting words into your mouth, will perhaps touch on this as well, the interrelationship between the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system, that is to say, the three great control systems of the body. And I certainly buy into the idea that he's mentioned already of this embodiment in not just a brain in a vat, but a brain in a body, somehow working with it and the other control systems of the body to give you a personalized take on the world. But that said, I think it's something physical. It's highly unique, but it is there as the physical interconnections of brain cells that in turn work with the other systems in the body.
Dan Siegel, Susan's talking about the body, but presumably when I use my mind, on those rare occasions when I do, it doesn't just involve my body, it involves interactions with other people. Mm-hmm. So is it a mistake if we just try to locate the issue within the skull, or should we look more generally at our interpersonal relationships?
Well, thank you, Alan. That's a really fantastic question. And, I agree with everything Susan's saying. And when you broaden the question about what the mind and brain are and how they relate to each other to fields like anthropology or sociology, or even the process of psychotherapy, or looking at Jane and Holly's relationship, you have this opportunity to actually look from a systems view of a process that regulates energy and information flow that certainly is not just in the skull, that the entire brain, as Susan is saying, is interconnected with the extended nervous system, the immune system, the hormonal system. The whole body, is really what we're talking about, I think, when we even think about the brain, or we should be thinking about the whole body. But then the social part of thinking that we are, in fact, social creatures, that we've evolved with incredibly social nervous systems, requires, when we think, let's say, in anthropological terms, to think about how culture is shaped by processes that are shared among many people. And so for the field I work in, interpersonal neurobiology, we locate the mind as a regulatory process that's both embodied, so it's beyond the skull, and it's relational. So the way energy and information will pass through this nervous system in this body is profoundly influenced by your question, which came from you. So when we say relational, you could be reductionistic and say, well, two nervous systems then, or all of our nervous systems, and say, okay, well, fine. But it's certainly not just a single skull view of how the mind emerges. And in that way, you can look at, which is my field of research, the way the relationship, the communication patterns between a parent and a child actually shape the neuronal development of that baby, and how the mind then emerges in a very different way. So relationships and neural functioning can be discussed in one sentence when you talk about patterns of energy and information flow. And it's hard to get your head wrapped around that initially. It sounds kind of airy-fairy and weird, But once you think in scientific terms about what's actually happening, then the mind can be defined, I think, in a very useful way as a regulatory process that's both embodied and relational.
And it's because of this relational aspect of things that you are able to talk to anthropologists. You have something to say to each other that's relevant to this subject.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where, in our research center, we study how cultural practices that are relational practices basically influence neuronal connections. And we literally do functional MRIs on people from different cultures and try to carefully analyze how relational practices influence matter.
Michael, you've written a book called It's Never Too Late to Change Your Mind. I can change my mind, I can't change my brain though, can I? Or can I?
Oh, I would say quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, all kind of theme that's come up in this morning's discussions is the various different ways that the brain, the physical brain, adapts and changes in response to experience, in response to what's going on in the world. So in the same way, one's mind is never static. I don't think one's brain is never static. I'm sure, if you looked at every molecule in a human brain, none of the ones that you started with are still there when you die. And so it's an extraordinarily dynamic physical system. Yet from that we somehow extract some kind of stable concept of a mind. That is a major challenge for thinkers. I definitely feel outside my comfort zone talking about philosophy. I'm sort of more of a neuroscientist, but I think one of the maybe pitfalls here is that we'd like to dichotomize in this area. You either have a mind or you don't have a mind. And I think that might be quite tricky because I think probably, for example, Jane's baby has a mind, obviously, but it's not the same kind of mind that she'll have when she's a 16-year-old or a 70-year-old. So I think there's definitely maybe a hierarchy or progression there. I do recall, and since, the audience and the theme, there's a Buddhist idea of a hierarchy of sentience. And so I think maybe there is a hierarchy of mindedness, and that we have to think about those different levels of the hierarchy neurobiologically maybe distinct or maybe not. I really don't know. From a personal point of view, a definition of mind escapes me. I think maybe it will continue to escape us because you almost need a superordinate intelligence to be able to understand, our level of complexity or intelligence. So, like I mentioned in my talk, I'm just in awe of this organ and this phenomena.
Jane, given the fairly practical issues with which you have to deal professionally, is this question too removed for you from your everyday concerns, or is it something that you find you have to address?
I don't think it's removed at all, but I think to pick up on what Susan said and Dan said and Michael said, the brain and the way in which the mind develops is shaped by your social environment. And we all know that. It's a little bit like the way we thought about genes 10 years ago, and the gene was going to be the answer to everything. Well, the gene-environment interaction we now know is really important, and that's what shapes the way in which we work with people. The same is true about the brain and the development of the mind. So to use Susan's example of technology, absolutely, and I'll use young people because that's who I work with. If you put a young person into a toxic environment, and it's a toxic environment of games and looking at your screen, and that's all you do, then of course the brain and the mind and the way in which it develops and the relationships that develop from that are not going to be good relationships. The flip side of that, however, which is the work that we do, and we've done with young people over the last 15 years, is if you look at the potential of young people and the potential of the developing brain and the way in which the mind interacts and the relationships that young people have, both online and offline, you have amazing capacity to harness both the brain and the way in which it develops, but also to harness the power of technology. And I'll use a really practical example. We've run a service called Reach Out in Australia, and it was started by people who were very concerned about the suicide rates. We involved young people, we involved mental health professionals, we involved a whole host of multidisciplinary teams, and really looked at how can you create an online and a safe environment that builds the capacity of young people. It's now populated by 100,000 young people each month, and they're not getting on to waste their time looking at things, they're getting on to think about how they build relationships, how they create supportive and safe environments where they can talk about issues that are of concern for them. So whether it's their sexuality, whether it's mental health, whether it's depression, whether it's simple things like going through a relationship breakup, all of the things that matter to a young person. So I believe if we can really harness the power of the brain and the mind, if we can harness the power of technology and we can combine the two to think about ways in which we create safe and supportive environments that build relationships rather than break them down, that's where our power will lie.
Susan Greenfield, this is an area that's been of some concern to you recently, hasn't it? What do you have to say about the relationship between young people and new technology?
The first is that I don't believe one can be too Manichaean about this and say, well, it's either good or it's either bad. Clearly, like with all technologies, they can be harnessed for good or ill, and I endorse what Jane says. What we need to do, though, is we need to take control. And rather than sleepwalking into these technologies and seeing what comes out, or being complacent saying, well, human beings never change, human nature's inviolate, I think that's a very dangerous stance to take, and we should be ahead of the game, and we should be deciding, what do we want? What do we want, and how can we then deliver it with this technology? But I'll express some of the concerns that I think we have at the moment, and perhaps the most obvious one, the most dangerous lesson perhaps someone is learning who plays computer games a lot, is that actions don't have consequences. When you play a game, by definition, you just play the game again. So it doesn't really matter what happens, whereas in real life, you can't undo something. Once it's happened, it's happened. Now, of course, you can come to terms with it, you can remedy the situation a little bit, you can live with it, you learn from your mistakes and so on, but the thing has happened, you can't undo it. Whereas with computer games, you just go back to square one again, and I think that is a problem, as is the continuity, therefore, of having a past, a present, and a future. And I think it's only when you have a past, a present, and a future, you have a significance or a meaning. And it might be that if you're in this atomized here and now world, just saying yuck and wow, you are perhaps reducing the meaning to what is happening. And once you have no meaning, then you are in serious psychiatric problem. Yeah. So I think that without sounding like a doom merchant, I'm not, contrary to what some of my detractors on the web say. I'm not that, but I'm just trying to say, let us take control and think of ways, neuroscientists, educationalists, parents, teachers, and so on, how we can actually craft software, if that's what we want to do, or design experiences for young people that enables them to reach their full potential.
The question of meaning, I think, is an interesting one. Daniel Siegel, given the people that you're working with, not just neurophysiologists, but as you say, anthropologists and so on, presumably the generation of meaning, how we find meaning and how we express meanings as opposed to simply signaling wildly is of some interest to you.
Sure. Well, Alan, you asked these great and simple questions, the difference between mind and matter, and how do we make meaning in life. So this is a simple panel.
I'm a very simple person.
So this actually builds on what Susan is saying, and it's tied into the question you're asking me. There are many ways, obviously, of looking at the concept of meaning. One is simply, what does something mean? What's the meaning of meaning? But I think you're asking a deeper level of what has significance in our lives. I think that's what you mean by meaning here.
Yeah, well, that's the sort of thing that Susan was talking about. Actions having consequences, which is a simple version of meaning.
Right. Yeah. So just to look from the perspective of the idea of the internet and video games and things like that, we've evolved this human brain over millions of years. And in the last 40,000 years, at least, we know that the primary evolution we've undergone is cultural evolution. In these years, we've been telling stories and finding meaning through the way of connecting past, present, and future that Susan beautifully talks about. And so in many ways, meaning comes from the inner way of integrating your experiences into a path that allows you to go across time. Now, as we do that, in whatever culture we're doing that in, what anthropologists tell us is that across cultures, what seems to be universal is the need for what's called contingent communication. So in other words, if you asked me, Alan, this question, Dan, say something about meaning, and I said, I really want to talk about how you make pizza because I'm really hungry right now, and pizza can have tomato sauce, and you'd go, what? You'd feel ignored, right? So the quality of our interaction there would be, I didn't give you a contingent response. And if you look at the way Holly and Jane would interact in their home, not in this setting, you'd find, as you would in any culture, that from the beginning of life, the baby needs responses that show that the caregiver is tuned in to the internal world of the baby. And when you study that, the baby's brain develops well. So meaning in a relational sense, and culture is just a huge collection of meaning-making relationships, meaning comes out of these ways that we are seen. I use the word mind sight for that your inner subjective world is seen in another person, mind sight for another, and you make sense of your own life, so you have the narrative Susan was referring to for mind sight for yourself. The problem, I think, with the incredibly enticing stimulation of the internet and also social networks is that they're superficially engaging kids in the drive to be connected, but they're actually not really developing mind sight. They're not really contingent. They're not like a face-to-face thing where if I look at you, Alan, and I say, wow, that was a really interesting question, and we engage and you could feel I'm tuned into your internal world. This will be a meaningful relationship that we're beginning to develop. And as we do that, then there'll be a sense of fullness, wholeness, that this was a meaningful and worthwhile experience. On the net, what I think happens is people are desperate to make connections. They have the illusion that those connections are really what they're seeking, but instead they're not getting the kind of face-to-face information flow that we need to develop fully this mind-sight capacity, which basically is the basis for social and emotional intelligence. So what we have is a relationship between a parent and a child begins, it's with peers, then it's with schools. We have this opportunity to allow people to really know the inner world of others and of themselves, which is the basis of compassion. And my fear, which I think goes along, Susan, with yours, is that these ways that the digital world is connecting people doesn't go fully to develop these various circuits of kindness and compassion that we need to really be keeping our eye on as this generation grows up.
Aside from the issues that you're addressing, Dan, which are really, I suppose, moral issues, I wonder whether there are practical ones. I might ask you, Michael, do you think this sort of digital technology, has it changed or has it given us new possibilities for the way in which our brains, our circuitry can evolve and change?
I think certainly so. Both Susan and Dan, Jane as well, have really been focusing on development and youth, children, that very key critical part of personhood. And appropriately so, there are concerns that these kind of technologies could lead to poor outcomes. What I'm not sure about yet is whether we can actually empirically show that that's happening rather than being worried about it or being alert to these issues. Maybe others on the panel may have some insights there. The other end of the spectrum, which is what I work with, which is older people, I think there are a lot of positive implications for technology like this, because generally we're dealing with an individual that is already well socialized, because they didn't grow up in this potentially toxic environment, if you want to call it that. So these individuals are well socialized, and what is at risk here is that the actual brain can degenerate either through disease or disuse. And now, in that case, we are, I think, starting to see a very big paradigm shift where people are recognising, well, it's not good enough just to stay sort of switched off and just slip gently into this night. So I think there are a lot of technological potentials out there. For example, I touched on one clinical trial which is actually using computers and even internet-based cognitive training, where you're actually specifically logging on to the internet in order to give your brain a bit of a workout. Now, the clinical trials of this are really looking positive. They're indicating that we can slow that slow decline that I showed on a graph, we can slow that process down by these very simple interventions. Whether we can actually prevent dementia, we still don't know, and those kind of big studies need to be done. So I think, as Susan mentioned, we really have to have a balanced view when it comes to these kind of technologies. In later life, I think there really are a lot of potentials, and I'll give one more example, which is, again, very practical, where clinical trials in Parkinson's disease have often relied on someone coming in, you come into a lab and you measure their tremor or the poverty of their gait or the way they walk forwards and backwards. Now people are using Y-sticks, taking them home and using that to record day-to-day tremor and movement at home. So we can have a very powerful insight into the physiology of an individual and how that may change in response to a treatment through using these kind of technologies. So there are a lot of opportunities there as well as possible risks.
Sorry.
Yeah, if I could just build on what Michael's saying, I think the point you're making is so excellent and so articulate about where a person's at when they're exposed to technologies, and that technology can be fabulous in certain situations. I do want to point out one area of research that was done in Washington State, where children were listening to what the media was, not the media, but the capitalist effort to take the Mozart effect and have children exposed at a very young age to all of these videos. And as you probably heard, now Disney had to pay back a lot of money because, in fact, the study showed that the time those young children were spending in front of a screen instead of in front of the face of a caregiver was tremendously changed, as you're pointing out, in these developmentally. They weren't socialized yet. They didn't develop these brain circuits. And those kids had much poorer development of skills like linguistic aptitudes. So there we saw an initial study that was overstated. The effort to capitalize on that and make money was then put into effect. Parents who want to do the best for their children see these cute little packages and they buy it. And then the study showed, in fact, it was damaging to their kids' development. So there, the issue is that it isn't the video by itself that was harmful. It's that the loss of time in relationship, and I guess I'm like Mr. Relationship today, but I mean the loss of time in face-to-face interactions that are the food of a developing brain can be lost in the face of that. And certainly technology is fabulous, but I think we need to remember that the more subtle ways in which relationships nurture us and keep the brain really alive, especially for young kids, can't be overstated. It's incredibly important.
Susan, you look, and then...
Yeah, I think if you're Mr. Relation, I'm misintegration.
Good.
Clearly, you have to look at the thing around. There's a world of difference between people that might be compromised in terms of their mobility, might live alone, and already have a conceptual infrastructure, and the opposite of that, people who are maximally mobile, perfectly fine for getting out and being and interacting in the world, and don't have a conceptual framework. Yeah? So one has to look at the needs of the person and the abilities and the portfolio that they present in order to decide how they're best going to benefit or not from a variety of experiences that we have. But I think what's really important in terms of going back to young people is this notion of privacy. And when I've spoken to young people, I think they feel emboldened by being in a more distant, sanitized scenario where someone is not looking in them in the eye, they're not seeing them gulp, they're not seeing them blush, they're not seeing wipe their sweaty hands on their trousers because they're nervous, And if you're not doing those things and you're used to this much more sanitized way of communicating. When you have to do those things, it will be more spooky and more aversive, which means you'll try and avoid doing it, which means it'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you might start distancing yourself altogether. I just make that prediction, but let's not confuse the technology with the person. I mean, I think the person has to be looked at in the round in terms of what stage they are in life, both physically and mentally. Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that, actually. When I was an adolescent, if I had any means of avoiding embarrassment, God, I would have embraced it.
Well, there you go. Well, that's exactly.
That's why you're on the radio now.
Yes. My case rests.
Jane.
I think that's a really good segue into... There's two pieces of research that I want to share, and then two very practical examples. The first piece of research, there's a group in America called the Pew Internet American Life Project. I don't know if you know of them, Dan, but they are a philanthropic organisation but associated with multiple universities. And they asked the question, do our online connections mean that we have less offline connections? Is it, as you're saying, taking away from our relationships and our capacity to engage with others, with our parents, with our teachers, with our friends? And this is a new report, and basically what it came back with was, for those people who have online connections, they have more offline connections, and they are using... So rather than us dichotomising it and saying, OK, well, we've got the internet and we've got this major problem of people sitting in front of it, what they're saying is people don't do that. They mesh the things. And if you are a young person and you are using the internet and you're using email and you're using social networking and you're using Twitter, it doesn't mean that that's just what you're doing. It actually enhances the relationships that you're having offline. So this is new research that's basically saying our fears, and I agree, I have great fears about what it would mean for a young person to sit in front of a TV or a computer all day. And to pick up on your point around the baby Einsteins, if I sit Holly down in front of baby Einstein, that's not going to be particularly helpful for her. But if I sit down with her and I play with her and I play with her toys and I have the music in the background, then there's the interaction happening and using that as a tool for facilitation of conversation. So that's the first piece of research from Pew. The second piece is around games and the way in which young people use games. And basically what they're saying is that, yes, there's absolutely a group who do use games in an inappropriate way, and it's a major challenge in terms of their mental health and well-being, and it's not good for them. It's not good for a young person to sit on their computer for 8 hours playing a game. It's not good for a young person to not be sleeping and playing a game. So we know that. But that's not the computer's fault or the game's fault. That's the parent's fault for allowing their child to play with their computer for 8 hours at a time, rather than actually having a conversation about what's appropriate or not. But what they found is that only 25% of young people are playing games that are considered a harmful game. And of those, the majority of young people, so about 90% of young people play games, the majority of them are playing games that are about world hunger, or that are about social interactions, or about multimedia players. So they're actually playing with other young people and having conversations about it. So that's the second piece of research. Now, I believe, as you've said, Susan, it's not an either-or. It's how can we navigate this and think about ways in which we can use it meaningfully.
We're coming towards an end, though not a conclusion. Just one thing, and I might just throw this one to you, Michael. We've had games for millennia, and we call them art in many cases. We have novels, we have dramas, and so on. Is modern digital technology, is that the continuation of art by other means, and does it engage us in the same way, or is it a totally qualitatively different thing, something totally new?
Again, such an easy question to finish with. With 1 minute to go, according to the screen.
You can do it.
No. You're asking the wrong person. But I do think there seems to be a lineage there. Technology, at least in my way of thinking, is just another manifestation of human culture, human endeavour, and all these games and so forth are as well. So I would imagine that they're within that same lineage, and what we're seeing is the media is changing. You know, at some point we didn't have oil painting and canvases, and we were using, you know, bits of rock and a smooth wall. So I think, you know, the media has changed, but those same inherent human desires and creativity, I think they're really fundamental.
You, Susan, you look as though you want to dash in very briefly. Session over.
Session over.
Okay. Yes. Game over.
Well, game is a very interesting issue about games, because adults have always played games, whether it's bridge or poker or charades or whatever. But always it's a means to an end. Usually a game has been a vehicle for some kind of social interaction with the perhaps, apart from patience or solitaire, which is always regarded as a rather sad thing to do. So usually the games you play are to achieve something, or I play squash, it's to keep fit and so on. This is the first time, and I'm not saying that everyone who purchases a computer game and every computer game is like this, but the first time that adult human beings have spent time and money just to purchase an experience where there's no consequences or significance or endpoint whatsoever other than to have an experience. And I find it rather strange that we've evolved to live longer and healthier lives now with biomedical sciences, and physical sciences have given us, and technology, more hours to the day. And how ironic that some people, not all, are spending some time just saying yuck and wow without just sitting in a room alone. And so I do find it, I think there is a big difference now that this is the first time that games have been an end in themselves.
Okay, I should possibly have begun with that question, because I think we could go on quite interestingly on that subject. But we do have to end. I had a sign up here which said session over, and the sign's gone off now, so it's obviously the whole system is in a bad mood with me. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel: Susan Greenfield, Daniel Siegel, Michael Valenzuela, Jane Burns, and Holly.
Yes.